Good morning, everybody. As well as having a long period of time in my career at client side, I'm now an independent agency owner. So kudos to you guys, because thank you. Now I know how it feels. One of the things I'd like to talk about is something that's occurred to me over the last few years. And whilst, of course, the world moves on in marketing, particularly with digital changing everything, but whilst we obsess about things like Facebook likes and programmatic and things like this, I would argue that we still haven't addressed some of the basics. Because every year, 80 to 90% of new products still fail, and we don't really know why. And it's been like that for the last 10 or 20 years. And marketing is all about behavior change. That's it. In essence, it's about behavior change, getting someone to switch to your brand or service or product and to buy more of it and to continue to do so. And yet we have things like this happening. You know, a very big brand relaunched from the pack in the background to the pack in the foreground. It passed, the new pack passed all of the benchmarks in qual and quant. They put it on shelf and then they had to withdraw it after 6 weeks because they lost $27 million in sales. So how come? How come when people in focus groups were asked which of these two packs they preferred and which they would buy, the majority of people said, I'd buy the one on the left, and the reason is because the cookies look bigger. But the brand owner decided to test both packs in store, and under normal conditions of purchase, this is what happened. Because when we're under time pressure and we're faced with complexity of choice, something in the brain makes us reach for the pack that looks like it's got more cookies in it. So people say one thing and they do another. So this is understanding this behavior is fundamental to marketing. Another example here, I'm going to ask you to do something now. Here's a price reduction, £8 down to $5.99, but shown two ways, as you can see. Now, objectively, of course, they're identical because the price reduction is the same. But I'm going to tell you that one of them significantly outsold the other. And I'm going to ask you to choose which one. So put your hands up if you think the price ticket on the right sold more. And who thinks the price ticket on the left? Perfect, thank you. You're a perfect audience. 50-50 split. And I showed this at a retail marketing conference to people who take decisions like this every day of their lives. How do I show a price reduction online, in store, in print, or whatever communication medium it is? So how are you going to decide? Who takes the decision? Well, I like this. Well, I like that. And each of you in the room who've got different opinions, you're all right. You've both got valid, cogent reasons to support your argument. Who's going to decide in the end? The client. And who within the client's going to decide? Because they're going to have the same issue you've just had, people voting for left or right. My argument is that we can avoid these lengthy, time-consuming, subjective, opinionated debates by turning somewhere else, by turning to fields of, would you believe it, science. Because science knows that if I asked a scientist which of these would sell more, he would tell me there are three effects that favour the ticket on the right. The way the brain processes numbers, a principle known as anchoring, and the way the brain processes price. So what happened in reality? Significantly more sales for the price ticket on the right, and people who bought that one rated the discount to be higher as well. So my argument here is that what is really going to affect output and outcomes and deliverables and money, commercial results, is by helping learn from science what changes behavior. And we practice what I call decision science, which is deliberately a blend of neuroscience, cognitive social psychology, and behavioral economics, because individually, of course, they're all very interesting and they all have interesting insights. Collectively, you get a really good holistic view of consumer behavior. And there are other areas in society that are already looking at this. You may have heard of the so-called nudge unit in the UK government, which is now exported to other countries. Even Obama last September issued made it mandatory to use behavioral science to serve the American people in public policy. So this is becoming part of the fabric of what we do. And this is what you guys need to understand. It also applies to the commercial world, and this was the moment that made me switch my career from client side to becoming part of this. I worked with Decoded on the relaunch of the T-Mobile brand throughout Europe, and the first manifestation of that was a Liverpool Street flash mob dance ad in the UK. This ad had no product message, no proposition, no price message, no promotional message, no call or network quality message, yet it was the single most successful TV ad in the history of UK telco market. Sales went up 49%, share by 6%. We increased penetration and frequency, which I've been told was impossible. You could do one or the other, but not both. We tripled brand consideration, and in terms of social, 40.5 million YouTube views is quite good. We then applied the same principles behind that advert to other brand touchpoints, the look and feel of the stores, the proposition development, and even customer service interactions. And over the period of the next 2 years, we halved customer churn, which is an enormous impact on the bottom line in telecoms. And we went from 4th in the market for customer satisfaction to joint top. So this stuff works, and other companies are applying money to this now. So we're working with people like Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Kentucky Fried Chicken, SAB Miller, to name but a few. This is where the smart money is going. Now, we have this guy to thank for a lot of it. I'm sure you recognize, I'm sure you've read his book, Professor Daniel Kahneman, who wrote an international bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow. And Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for Economic Sciences in 2002 for his work on decision making. And he talked about 2 systems of decision making. I've actually found a lot of people have been a victim of one of those systems of decision making because they've just pigeonholed what Kahneman says into an existing paradigm. So they just think of his system 1 as emotional and his system 2 as rational. And I have to tell you, if anyone says that to you, they haven't understood Kahneman. Because if I tie my shoelaces, that's a system 1 activity. It's automatic, it's intuitive, it's spontaneous, it's implicit, it's been learned. But tying my shoelaces is not really emotional, is it? Or walking around is a system 1 activity. You wouldn't call that emotional. It's all about automatic mental processes versus controlled mental processes. I'm going to ask you to do something now that will help you experience the difference between these 2 systems. So I'm going to show you a series of coloured words on the screen, but before I do that, I wanted to just promote Daniel Kahneman's latest venture, which of course is an aftershave, because DK Intuition is probably where he's now heading, because he's become so famous. But now I'm going to show you these colour words on the screen, and I want you to call out loud, as quickly as you can, the colour of the word you see on the screen. That's it, simple, just the colour. And I'll give you a clue. The first one is red, okay? Are you ready? Let's go.
Red, black, red, green, blue, yellow, blue.
Oh, come on, guys. Okay, so I'm not just telling you dry abstract theory that won a Nobel Prize. You've experienced it. You've felt this clash between the controlled and the automatic mental systems. Now, this is fundamental when it comes to marketing, as this experiment shows, because we obsess about people engaging with our brands and getting emotional resonance and things like this. This experiment shows the brain scans of the same person faced with different images of brands. Now, the task was choose a brand to buy. And what they did before they showed people in this experiment pairs of brands in photographs, they asked them to name their favourite brands in a number of different categories, and also other brands of which they would also buy. So their consideration set, their purchase set, if you like. So what the scientists knew was which is this person's favourite and which are other brands that are not the favourite but they would also buy. And then they paired at random, they paired photographs and showed them to people in the brain scanner and said, look at these brands and choose a brand to buy. And here's the brain's reaction. Now, Decoded asked me, they showed me this when I was their client. They said, Phil, look, you spent years building brands. Which is the brain's response to the favourite brand? And I said, oh, come on, guys, is this a ridiculous question? you build brand equity, you build emotional resonance, you build all of this engagement. Of course the brain's going to respond. It's the one on the left because that's where all the neurons are firing and where all the blood oxidation is going. But guess what? It's not. The brain on the left is thinking, which brand should I buy? The brain on the right has seen its favourite and decided just like that. So despite us talking all this lovely narrative about emotional engagement, etc., actually what the brain is doing is buying based on a no-brainer decision. A favourite brand becomes a shortcut. It becomes a default. And the brain loves that because it's the most efficient way to make decisions, because it burns the least amount of energy. And that's exactly why this whole System 1 thing has evolved over millennia to be a very efficient user of energy, because energy is important. The brain consumes a lot of energy, and we need energy for survival, not for buying brands, for something much more important, to survive. And so we will make this as efficient as we can. So how do we deal with this? These are the things that you guys need to know. Well, here's a framework that we use that builds upon Kahneman for how we manage this. So over on the left-hand side, you've got everything you're doing. You're creating touch points for your clients, whether it's digital or atomic, whatever form it is, sponsorship, packaging, it doesn't matter. Those represent data coming into the brain. And over on the right-hand side, we have behavior. Hopefully the behavior that we want. But in between those 2 points, we've got the brain, which we've just simplified in terms of 3 steps of processing. Firstly, you have attention and perception. You have to get into the brain in the first place. It probably goes without saying that consumers don't read your strategy papers. All they can deal with are the perceptible and tangible stimuli that come to them. And out of sight is quite literally out of mind. So what I find, and I was guilty of this as a marketeer, you spend a lot of time worrying about the right-hand end, about the motivation and the persuasion end, and we often ignore the left-hand end. You've actually got to get into the brain in the first place. And I'm going to show you an example in a moment of that. Then we have intuitive understanding or cognition. So here the brain is taking the data that comes in through our 5 senses and it's turning it into meaning. And this all happens subconsciously. And it happens automatically and it happens in milliseconds. So the brain is using its associative memory that we've built up from birth to make sense of all the data coming in. Metaphorically asking 2 questions. What is it? What does it represent? Where do I know this thing from? And then finally we get persuasion, which could be based on just a fast decision rule we call a heuristic or a nudge, as they've commonly termed, or it can be goal-based decisions, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But let's just have a quick look at some of the things that science can help us with and that you can help your clients with. So we're going to look at attention and perception very quickly. So if I show you this, what jumps out? The cue, absolutely. The cue jumps out up there. I'm a bit disappointed. I hope you might say the F, which is over here. But no, the reason you didn't spot that is because of a hard and fast scientific principle that our attention snaps to things that contrast with the surroundings. Contrast in colour, in shape or in size. And that's why you looked straight at the cue. That's why the cue jumped out. Now, visual neuroscience knows this so well that it's even possible now to write some software to replicate what your eyes just did. And this is a tool that we use. We used it with a client, British Telecom, who had a piece of direct mail that wasn't working for them. And when we used this tool, which you can see here with the hot spots of attention, we said the problem with your material is the face at the bottom. Because, again, a hard principle from science, there's nothing more rewarding to the human brain than another human being, in particular faces. We will pay attention to. And it's sucking attention away from the call to action, which is those roundels on the right-hand side in the middle of the page. So quick and dirty solution, we said to the client, take the face off. Because then the principles of contrast kick in, and look where attention goes now, straight to the call to action. So that's what the theory says. Let's see if it worked in practice. What actually was the outcome? Well, British Telecom tested this, did A/B testing, and the one on the right increased response rate by nearly 1/3. And they send out millions of mailings. So that is not a trivial increase in response rate. So you can get people to look where you want them to look. And you can use that to drive sales. So why wouldn't you want to know this sort of stuff as an agency? We did exactly the same by changing the layout of one of their print ads. We didn't change the offer. The offer was identical before and after. We simply changed the layout and call volumes went up 27%. So this is powerful stuff. Let's have a quick look at the middle block now about cognition and understanding. So another question for you, which of these would sell more? Right, okay, yeah, you're right. The one on the right has a 20% higher purchase intention. The reason being that the majority of people in the population are right-handed. And what happens when you see that image, you can't stop this happening. Your brain automatically simulates picking up that fork. So what happens if your art director is left-handed? Yeah, this is stuff you should know about. And it's quite simple and it's quite easy to apply, but look at the commercial impact that it has. Why would you not want to know about this stuff? This is a principle known as fluency, which is the ease of mental processing. The brain loves things that are easy to process. And another way to do that, because we can't go advertising and putting our clients' brand names everywhere, is to use what we call iconic assets. So these are things that can evoke the brand without the brand name being present. They could be colors, shapes, they could be sounds, they could be fragrances, certain phrases, certain celebrities, but they have the ability to evoke the brand. Now, you've never seen that particular Coca-Cola logo up there because it doesn't actually spell Coca-Cola, but your brain immediately jumped to it because of the flowing script and the red color. We have a way of testing this we call branding power score, and here are some examples of branding power score. From on the right-hand side, this is the activation of the correct brand. So the Apple logo, not surprisingly, scores very highly. And let's have a look at the other brands underneath it. We have the Magnum ice cream bar shape. We have the Coca-Cola bottle. The one in the middle is not Qantas Airlines. Actually, a lot of people think that, but it's actually Foster's Lager. Then, a bit difficult to see, that's a Stella Artois advert. Andy McDowell from L'Oreal, and then finally, oh dear, a negative branding power score for Dolce & Gabbana's fragrance, The One. The reason being that about 20 years ago, Calvin Klein launched CK1, and they now own the word one. So if you're Dolce & Gabbana, every dollar I spend promoting that fragrance activates my competitor. Every dollar. Because I have a negative branding power. So you have a strategic choice. What do I do with this? Do I continue to invest and hope that I build that activation, or do I actually change the name or drop it? Here's a really nice example as well from Magnum. They're just the bar shape, no other element of branding, just the shape has a 90% activation of the brand and very low activation of competitors. But look over here. This is a Haagen-Dazs advert. Now again, science tells us that the average dwell time on a print ad is about 2.1 seconds. This is a double-page spread. Over on the right-hand side, we already know the principle of contrast is going to make people pay attention to that bar shape, and guess which brand it activates? Oops. So again, as a client or the agency, wouldn't you want to know this? Because you want to know where to place your bets. You want to know what's going to evoke the brand above the line and through the line, even in store. Now then, finally, we're just going to look at goals, because as a marketeer, this is the most important bit for me of everything that I learned about decision science. This is a very important neuroscientific experiment done at Stanford, where people were put in brain scanners and they were shown images of different products and brands for 4 seconds. Then they were shown the price for 4 seconds, and then they were given 4 seconds to make a purchase decision. Press a button, yes or no, will you buy that brand for that price? And what the neuroscientists wanted to do was just observe what happened in the brain at those different points in time. And what happened was very, very interesting, and for us, fundamental and significant. Because when people see a brand, the so-called reward center in the brain is activated. Now, this was significant because the scientists already knew from many other experiments that when this part of the brain is activated, there's a very high probability that action will follow. And that's plausible, isn't it? We see something that's rewarding to us, we want it, we want to approach it, we want to acquire that thing. When you show a mother an image of her children, the reward center in her brain is activated. So brands are very, very powerful things in the brain. What happened when people saw the price? Something very different, the pain center in the brain. Yeah, literally, this is the same part of the brain that's triggered if you cut yourself, if you fall over and hurt yourself. So price is hot in the brain. I mean, the brain is metaphorically saying, that's really nice, I want that, it's pleasurable and rewarding, but ouch, I have to give away money, that's loss aversion. It hurts me to acquire the reward or the pleasure. And then what happened was a trade-off, and if the reward activation was sufficient to overcome the pain activation, then the person pressed yes. And if it wasn't, they pressed no. And the scientists could predict, just watching the levels of activation, which button they were going to press. And this is what we call the net value of a purchase equation. And in our industry, it gives us two very powerful levers to pull. We have the reward lever and the pain lever, and we can pull those to make the net value of the equation positive. Now, rewards are absolutely fascinating because essentially rewards are brand equity. Rewards are the reason why when you give people Pepsi and Coke in a blind tasting test, the majority prefer Pepsi. But when you brand it, look what happens. The majority prefer Coke. Even, by the way, if it's Pepsi in the glass, but you've told them it's Coke. Because that has changed their perceptions. And for them, that perception is reality. Well, for all of us, perception is reality. It has changed their subjective experience. But what is that thing that we've always wrestled with, this woolly, intangible brand equity thing? And it is all about rewards. And we've got a way now to quantify it. Because achieving our goals is rewarding for the brain. And what I found fascinating talking to my colleagues in Decoded, who are all scientists and academics, I would say to them, how do you know this stuff? And they'd look at me blankly and say, but Phil, how come you don't know this stuff? Because we've been dealing with this is a study that was done 20 years ago, or everybody knows this particular principle. And this is a fabulous body of science, goal-directed behavior. People saying, and all agreeing, whether it's neuroscience or cognitive or social psychology, all agreeing that human behavior is goal-directed. The other thing that's really interesting for me, before I tell you about what the goals are, is that it struck me that many of the metrics that we use client-side are outcome metrics. So things like meaningful brand or brand love or some other brand attachment or purchase intention or what attitudes, whatever it might be, they are all the results, they are all the outcomes of some other process. And that other process is goal achievement. Because if I talk to clients now and they say, oh, I need to boost my score on meaningful brand, and I say, well, what's the meaning behind meaningful? They look at me a bit blankly. Or what drives brand love? What do you mean by brand love? Why does your customer love your brand? And by the way, your competitor's customer also gives the same brand love score to their brand, but for different reasons. So what are those different reasons? And again, you get blank faces. So some of these outcome measures like meaningful brand are actually meaningless unless you come back upstream and understand what's driving that outcome. And that outcome is goal achievement. So what science tells us about goals is there are three fundamental drivers in terms of neuropsychology in the brain. There's autonomy goals, security goals, and excitement goals. Autonomy goals are all about who's the leader of the pack. This is about power, superiority, recognition, status, self-esteem, and self-confidence. Security goals are all about closeness, warmth, belonging, tradition, trust, care, warmth. And excitement goals are the novelty-seeking system in the brain. This is why I have a real issue when people talk to me about millennials, because actually millennials show exactly the same behaviours as the previous generation did, and the previous generation to that, and the previous, and all the ones in the future will, by the way. Every decade they'll show the same because we all are driven by the same goals. These don't change in a decade. These have evolved over millennia. So excitement is novelty seeking, it's curiosity, it's about zest for life, hunger, vitality, and looking for new sensations and new experiences. Now the link between this and brands is actually very simple, because when thousands of years ago men beat each other over the head with clubs to determine who was the leader of the pack, nowadays we do exactly the same, but we do it symbolically through the cars we drive and the clothes we wear and the watches we wear, because otherwise we'd all drive the same cars, we'd all wear the same watches and the same clothes, because they'd all be the same, wouldn't they? Functionally, virtually identical. But of course we don't, because we've come to associate those, and our System 1 associative memory has built associations between brands as being instrumental in helping us to achieve our goals. And as a business, we've developed this further into a map which has 6 areas on it, which is populated with a number of goals within the map. It's not shown here. But we need to be careful how we measure this stuff, because coming back to Kahneman's System 1, System 2, here's an example of measurement, because traditionally a lot of our market research measures have only tapped into System 2. So here's a live example from one of our clients, a banking client. On the left-hand side, what you see are a bunch of brand attributes, and then the first data set is their tracking study, measuring them versus a competitor. The data set on the right are the same attributes, but now using a different technique. This is an implicit measurement technique that accesses and measures System 1 in the brain. So this is looking at the automatic, spontaneous, intuitive response. And look at the differences in the data sets. The implicit set is far more sensitive to the real differences between the bank brands. And in some cases, the data points are actually reversed. And this is significant because up to now, you and your clients are using a data set on the left to plan activity and to make strategic choices and to allocate budgets, whereas consumers' brains are working with the data set on the right. So this is why it's very important to understand. Now, we use this type of measurement and this model to help not just strategically to understand what drives category purchase and brand relevance and distinctiveness, but also at an executional level to test advertising and output. Now, many of you will remember Cadbury's Gorilla campaign, very, very famous campaign. I doubt many of you will remember its successor called Trucks, which came out soon afterwards, written to the identical brief, same creative team, same director, and it completely died. Sank without trace. And we measured both ads, and it's obvious when you measure the goals with which they're associated. You can see in the spider chart on the left-hand side just how differently those ads perform, despite the brief being identical. And on the right-hand side, the fit with purchase drivers was also very different. So it's really good to understand what is really driving purchase and what is being signaled to this autopilot system that is being picked up that we might otherwise miss. Similarly with T-Mobile, part of Deutsche Telekom, we still work with Deutsche Telekom throughout Europe, and the relaunch was based on doing exactly this type of work. We also found a positive and strong correlation between goal achievement and loyalty cohorts as well, which was fascinating and of course then led back to revenue. So finally, let's just have a look at the question I posed at the beginning. How could a big marketing company like PepsiCo make such a terrible mistake with the relaunch of Tropicana packaging? And I'm going to use just a couple of examples from what I've shown you to explain this. The first is what happens when we shop a supermarket. Now, what you see at the bottom here are blurred images of the 2 packs at the top. And the reason I've blurred them is deliberate. It's because it replicates our peripheral vision. Because don't forget, when you're working with material and when you present material to a client or it's stared at for 2 hours in a focus group, you are giving it your full undivided attention in pin sharp focus, 20/20 vision and full colour. When I'm walking down a supermarket aisle like this, the majority of what I see is out here. It's peripheral vision, 120 degrees, and as we go to the periphery it becomes blurred. And if you don't believe me, when you read my book, look in the margin, see if you can read the words 2 or 3 centimetres to the left or the right, and you can't because they're blurred. So simple tip for you, you can do this in PowerPoint, blur images of material you produce, give it to someone who doesn't know what it is and say to them, what is it? To see if it's perceptible. Now what happens under those conditions is, as you can see, the iconic assets of Tropicana with the old pack still come through. They're still perceptible. That orange you can see very, very clearly. On the right-hand side, what is it? Who is it? Which brand is it? Is it own label? I have no idea. It just merges into a bland mess. The second thing is when you measure these brands at an implicit level, you can see they're associated with very different goals. The original pack on the left, the signals on that pack, the codes on that pack are about freshness, naturalness, realness. You can't get fresher than an orange just picked off a tree and a straw stuck straight into it. Whereas the pack on the right is orange served in a fluted wine glass. And the brain's then recoding this. Where do I know this from? Where do I recognise orange served in a fluted wine glass? Special occasion, brunch, business meeting, wedding, Bucks Fizz. That's not how you serve orange juice to the kids on the breakfast table. So the change in graphics signals a very different meaning to the autopilot. So those are just two of the reasons why it failed. Now, when we did this with BT, and you can go into clients with some of this science background, and it's now not just a question of trust me, it's here's what science tells us. It gives you much more gravitas and authority to be able to sell work to clients because you've got science on your side. And when we did this with BT, these increases in response rates were the highest in living memory at that client, they told us, which is very nice. So if you want a deeper look, you have my book. Hope you enjoy it. Please give me your feedback. I'd love to hear your feedback. If anyone wants to take this further with us, we do training, we do consultancy, we do research. Very happy to take any questions over lunch. By the way, I'll still be here for lunch. So just thank you now from me for your attention.
I think it's my job to deal with the elephant in the room, which a few people mentioned earlier, and I was glad that you raised that. Thank you, Martin. Because what's really going on in media? Not much. It's been quiet, actually. We're a dedicated, we're a management consultancy, essentially, that specializes in media and advertising. As you might imagine, it's been a busy few years, but particularly a busy last kind of 7 or 8 days, and I'll come on to talk about some of the bigger impacts of media and questions over trust and transparency that you may be aware of. The first thing I should say first off is thank you to Julian and the thenetworkone team and everybody for putting this on because, and not least for allowing me to come and share, but also this is a fantastic time to be independent, as I'm sure you probably all agree. We're an independent company. Just the ability to provide inspiration in an objective and trusted way is fantastic, and what a great forum. So congratulations and thank you for doing that. ID Comms, as I say, is a management consulting business. We specialize in media. And this is our proposition to advertisers. We only work with brands. We're lucky to work with some of the world's leading advertisers. We're truly independent, and we are their partners in media change. And you'll know that the media industry has undergone incredible change over the last decade. This is my kind of hypothesis for you today, is that the value of independent, and I'm talking about media agencies, but the value of independence in agencies will increase as the market differentiates. And I'll come on to kind of break that down and explain what I mean. And we'll revisit that at the end, and you can tell me whether you think that's a hypothesis delivered. So let's just break that down. So independence, what does independence mean when you talk about media agencies? Well, it's a freedom that you have, freedom of control that you have in your own businesses. But actually independence of thought within media is really, really important. I think I think it was Amanda on the panel earlier, talked about agencies perhaps being tempted to make recommendations that serve their own business interests, perhaps sometimes more than the client's interest. So independence and objectivity is obviously critical, and that has a direct impact on the value that you can provide to your advertiser clients. It's also an incredibly powerful word in media: freedom from control, influence, support. And it's more important now than it's ever been in media. I was a lawyer. I finished law school, so I take a passing interest in law and regulation, and I love contracts and things like that. So I was interested from a kind of lawyer's perspective. Where has independence been tested? The definition of independence been tested. And one of the most interesting examples of that is in the financial services industry. So if you're familiar with, you may not be familiar with the Retail Distribution Review, perhaps, that happened in 2012, but I'm going to very exciting. I'm going to tell you all about it. And you might wonder why it's relevant to our discussion today, and hopefully that will become clear. So in 2002, new regulation in the UK needed to make a differentiation, or actually a definition, of what it means to be an independent financial advisor. So an independent financial advisor, or an IFA, as they became known, was the go-to person if you really wanted to buy a financial product as an individual. So if you wanted to invest, if you wanted a mortgage or invest in a pension, things like that. And as the name suggests, obviously they were intended to be and give you independent advice, right, on your financial investments. But the retail distribution review was really prompted by the fact that majority of independent financial advisors were actually not independent at all, because a lot of them were earning their income from the product provider. So these are the financial institutions that offer mortgages or pensions, things like that, were paying commission and very, very valuable jollies. And I've spoken the last few weeks, because this is a point of interest, I've spoken to quite a lot of IFAs, and they all recounted the amazing trips and restaurants and holidays that they went on, courtesy of the big financial institutions, which, whilst they all agree that the review was good news for the industry, they all miss, obviously, their golf trips, and everybody commented that their golf handicap had gone down in the last 4 years. So independent financial advisors were selling products or making recommendations to customers, us, with what they called a bundled fee. So you'd pay a fixed percentage, and then somewhere in the terms and conditions at the back of that, it may break it down and may disclose what the financial advisor may have been making from the provider side, okay? So it's not really in the customer's interest. They had no visibility of what incentives were being paid to the IFA to recommend certain products. And if you're a customer and you go to somebody called an independent financial advisor, you expect independent advice, and you weren't getting that. Of course, that affected their independence. So what this review did, actually, is it told IFAs that they had to differentiate, and they had to be, by legal definition, either independent or restricted. And independent meant that they could not earn any income from the provider side, but had to be paid purely on a fee by the customer based on what that customer was prepared to pay for that advice. And there are clear compliance rules on how they're allowed to present to the customer what they are going to charge, okay? The alternative, and you had to designate whether you wanted to be independent or whether you wanted to be restricted as a financial advisor. As a restricted financial advisor, you could recommend, you could work and earn money from certain providers, okay? And the obligations of independent was that they are not allowed to receive commission. They are obliged to review and know or offer any suitable product in the marketplace. They have to give, and this is in the legislation, they have to give fair, unbiased, and unrestricted advice. Annually, they have to make a statement of professional standing. So they have to declare every single year to a regulatory body, which is the FCA, Financial Conduct Authority, which is a government organisation here. They have to assert their independence every year. And then they are highly regulated, and there's huge kind of compliance requirements of IFAs now. But of course, the benefit there was to the consumer. So it gave greater transparency to a customer of actually what was going on, and that gives confidence, right, from a customer's perspective, that you're getting the right advice and you know what you're paying for that advice. The implications are actually that there's a lot of the IFAs that I spoke to said that there's a lot of administrative chores they now have to do in terms of compliance. But the good thing about that, actually, has been, whilst it's more time for them, it's got rid of what lots of them called the rogue element, which was the IFAs who were perhaps not operating wholly in the interests of their clients. And actually, a lot of those moved on, and they've gone into different parts of financial services or maybe into different industries because they don't want to take on the administrative responsibility of complying with the FCA. Okay? So it's actually improved the quality of the individuals in amongst IFAs. And the other thing which was really surprising to me, because I thought, well, as soon as you tell, I mean, much like Phil's just described, right? As soon as you tell a customer with more clarity, really the price, like what goes into the sausage, it looks more expensive, was the first problem. And also they're going to have to spend much more time on the compliance stuff. And so that's got to affect their profitability. But actually every single IFA said that they are more successful since regulation, and revenues are higher and profits are higher. Really interesting. Okay, so what does it mean? So that's independence, just as a kind of an example, the importance of independence. What does agency mean? This is from a friend of a friend who's a judge. We asked them actually what they thought the definition was in this context of an agent. An agent is not permitted to make an undisclosed profit from its actions on behalf of the principal. Only one exception is maybe where there's a contractual agreement that is allowed, that they are allowed to do so. Okay? So given that, which way now for media? Like in the IFA market, which I just described, right now there is a problem with trust and transparency, particularly in media agencies, as a few of you have referenced on an earlier panel as well. Earlier this year, we conducted a piece of research, my only two sciencey kind of slides. This one, we asked 150 marketers from around the world. We asked also opinion of agencies and procurement. Two headlines. One is that the overwhelming majority of respondents believe that trust is a really important and a key principle of kind of business relationships and will deliver stronger marketing performance. Another interesting part of the report and the results that we found was that, I don't know if you can read these, but the top line here, how a media agency manages rebates, their relationships with media vendors. So in that IFA example, their relationship with the provider of media in this case, and how agency kind of buying deals work. These were the highest ranked concerns amongst marketers of things that would influence, or elements of transparency that would influence the trust in their media agency. So clearly it's a really commercial problem, this lack of trust, and it comes from transparency. Okay, so let's go on to the elephant. You may or may not know, the ANA is the Association of National Advertisers, formed in 1910. It's the largest single marketer trade body, I think, in the world, with 1,000 members, represents $300 billion of annual marketing spend in the US. And it's the voice of advertisers in America. We're going to do some little pop quiz. Anybody know who this man is? It's a very important man. This guy is called John Mandel. John Mandel is the ex-CEO of Mediacom, media agency in the US. He left about 10 years ago. In March 2015, John Mandel stood up in front of a crowd about double this size at an ANA conference in Florida in the US, and perhaps for the first time publicly made a declaration on the ANA stage that the US media market was a rebate market. Therefore, it was an independent market, potentially, by that test. What that triggered was a whole succession of different events, which I'm just going to walk you through as a quick potted history. This man, anybody know who this is? Erwin Schrödinger. Anybody's heard of Schrödinger's cat test? Schrödinger theory was that if you put a cat into a box and you leave it alone and you can't see the cat, at some point it may or may not die, but at any given moment you were not aware whether the cat was dead or alive, and so therefore it was potentially both at the same time. The reason I'm telling you this is because it has a great parallel to the narrative around rebate practice in the US. Depending on who you ask, people will either tell you that the US is an entire rebate market and it's been going on for years, or people will tell you that it absolutely doesn't exist. So we were faced at a point until John Mandel, where we believed both cases to be true, and we were unsure why. And the ANA very rightly decided to tackle this problem. This gentleman is called Bob Liodis. He's the president and CEO of the ANA. He really is the voice of advertisers in the US. And he said that they would launch an investigation into rebate practice in the US to demystify their language, give a perspective on these non-transparent behaviors, and understand really what was going on. Anybody know this man? This is Erwin Gottlieb. Erwin Gottlieb is the global CEO of Group M, so really the people call him the godfather of media, which sounds kind of intimidating, but he is probably the most senior and kind of widely known and respected media executive in the world. Controls companies which obviously manage billions and billions of dollars of advertising investment. At a conference I attended in Phoenix in May last year, Bob interviewed Erwin. They talked about this transparency issue. Erwin's words, and he was correctly right, I think, that there needs to be a building of mutual trust, better trust and understanding between the advertiser and the agency when it comes to these kind of things. So what the ANA did is that they launched a search. They issued an RFP to find a firm, an external independent firm that could look into this practice and open Schrodinger's box, you might ask. That happened in the summer. We tendered for it. There were 30 companies, I think, that tendered for it. We were one of the 29 that didn't win it. Well, but the people that did get it, which I was fascinated to hear, was a company called K2 Intelligence. These gentlemen are father and son. They're called the Krolls. They founded Kroll, which is a corporate investigations firm, often used by companies looking to make business deals in untransparent markets around the world. So they do a lot of investigations into, oil markets and things like that on behalf of large corporations. They were brought in. They employ ex-FBI kind of negotiators and investigators and guys from the CIA and things like that. These are kind of hardcore investigation firm. So they won this tender. It was their job to shine a light on rebate practice in the US. They interviewed about 160 people. I was one of them. I went to New York and met with not these guys, but their team, which I was expecting to feel a little bit like this. Although I'm fully independent, have nothing to hide, but they were interested in validating and getting more information about some of the experiences that we've had working with advertisers and agencies. It turns out it was just like meeting your bank manager, and they were very polite and very nice. There was no interrogation happened at all. So that's been going on for the last kind of 9 months or so. Just in May, a month or so ago, I was in this beautiful place, Boca Raton in Florida, for the ANA's 2016 conference. The anticipation was that at this conference that they would then present the results of the K2 investigation. They didn't do that. It's much to everybody's disappointment because simply the report wasn't ready. But last week, Tuesday, June the 7th, K2 published a 58-page report called An Independent Study of Media Transparency in the US Advertising. I recommend that you read it because it's kind of interesting. Just read the first 5 or 6 pages. But it declared there is non-transparent practice in the US market, and they called it pervasive based on their investigation. It wasn't limited to any type of media agency. It was, in their words, all types, the full spectrum of agency. Not all agencies, but all types of agency. It wasn't just operating in the fringes of kind of some nascent digital technologies or dealings. They found evidence of rebate or non-transparent practice in TV, radio, outdoor, as well as digital. And one of the lead investigators from K2 on a call that we had, a briefing call we had with them, said agencies had failed a fiduciary duty. So agencies, of course, have said that they operate within the boundaries of their contract, which I think is true. Lots of people, in the last 7 days, we've spoken like back to back to many, many marketers around the world looking for answers and guidance on this stuff. Also spoken to a lot of analysts. We do a lot of work with investment analysts, as well, and their most common questions are, is anyone going to go to prison? Answer is probably no, because there's no contractual breach probably in this. Secondly, they keep saying to us, is this going to trigger a massive wave of global media reviews? I think the answer is no for the moment, but probably 2017 maybe. So there's a contractual obligation, but K2's assertion was that there's a fiduciary duty that you have to your clients, and that had been failed in a large way. The agency community responded quite predictably, perhaps, to initially just try and discredit the report. And I understand completely their perspective. Anybody know who this man is? Yeah. So his words, I mean, uncomfortably for him, on the 8th of June, on Wednesday the 8th of June, was the WPP annual general meeting. And Paul Martin had to stand up and defend his £70 million annual pay deal to his shareholders. That was kind of bumpy, but of course he got asked about this report, and these were his words from the AGM. It's in no way independent, it's one-sided. I agree with his approach that the agencies are kind of under attack and he's got to defend that. The only way you can do that is perhaps call into question the validity of the report itself. I think it's wrong to say it's one-sided. He went on to say that no holding companies like WPP had contributed to the report, so therefore it was one-sided. But he didn't point out that they were all invited to participate, but all declined. And so inevitably, it doesn't represent the interest, perhaps, of a company like WPP. This lady is Nancy Hill. Nancy is the CEO of an organization called the 4As. The 4As are the trade body in the US representing agency interests. They are at war with the ANA, it's fair to say right now. The narrative from both sides is making reference to the Cold War in public, which is not helpful. But Nancy said the report is anonymous, inconclusive, and one-sided, so the same thing. Is this the end? No, this is the start. This is the beginning of something, not the end of something. We've learnt, we have information now. The parallel that we keep talking about in the last 7 days is that this is a bit like the Panama Papers, with stuff that we perhaps suspected that might be happening. We weren't really able to pass a judgment or not. But now we've got some fact, okay? And our challenge to our clients that we work with and to marketers around the world is this is the beginning, action needed. If you wanted to dig into that, we've written a lot about the impact of that. Actually, this morning, I think we've just launched, hopefully somebody in my team has sent this out today while I'm here, is what we call the Post-K2 Media Manifesto, which is a set of principles for marketers in this. Some of you might have seen, we do a weekly vlog as well, which is on YouTube, you can find, called Media Snack, or look for the hashtag RebateGate, which we've been posting everything against. So what we need, when all the rhetoric is so aggressive at the moment, is actually what we want as bridge builders. We need clients, advertisers, and agencies on both sides to start to rebuild that trust, that failing trust and transparency. And this is the start point. I think there's goodwill on both sides to take this insight and make more of it. The question for next week is, can we talk about this? So I'm going to Cannes on Sunday. It will be interesting. Obviously, this will be a big part of discussion, certainly amongst the executives from media agencies and some senior clients. We've already heard from a lot of advertisers that they are actually setting up meetings with their agency to tackle these questions in Cannes, because they're all going to be there. So that'll be kind of interesting, doing that on the top of a $100 million yacht, maybe. But the good thing is, actually, that Cannes offers on this debate is that it takes people out of the mindset of their day job. It gets people together in perhaps more of a collaborative spirit without the pressures, without the kind of daily pressures. And hopefully something good will come of that. So I think I'm looking forward to good ideas coming out of Cannes. And the focus from our perspective is, I'm always with Warren, particularly when he says these things. Price is what you pay, value is what you get. That's everything you need to know about the global media market in one very clever sentence from Mr. Buffett. The obsession, we have had an obsession as an industry on the price of media and the discount achievable on media. and we have to change that conversation to understand the value of media, the impact it has, the outcome it has for the advertiser's business. If we can do that, we get rid of all of the kind of bad conversation. It takes a lot of change in behavior from a marketer's side to be able to do that, and also to be able to hire and work with a media agency based on a value proposition, not based on a price and a discount. I was at a conference a few weeks ago called Media 360, which is a UK conference for the media industry. And a gentleman called Andrew Mortimer, who's head of media at Sky, broadcaster in the UK. They are the largest advertiser in the UK by a mile. They spend about £200 million a year on media in the UK. And that's Andrew's and his team's responsibility. And he, they're a broadcaster, they're a response-driven advertiser, they're a high-performance digital marketer. You wouldn't necessarily expect Andrew or Sky to perhaps come out with this kind of sentence, but he said this, and it's brilliant. He said, the craft of media planning has been lost to the obsession of metrics. We've got to get back to the craft of media that we've lost, really through the obsession of price and discount. Because what we're doing as advertisers is buying cheaper and cheaper media, thinking that that is success, but it's ceasing to drive business in the way that it should do. What I always like to say is that we've outsourced to algorithm and given up responsibility of media's contribution to their marketing mix, and I think that's really sad. We will get that back. And perhaps this is the point now. This is a point where we need, much like the financial services markets, we need a point of differentiation. I think today or tomorrow, if you pick up a copy of Campaign in the UK, I wrote a piece in this week's edition calling for clearer differentiation of media agencies around the world. We can either be trusted advisors, like independent financial advisors, or we can be more commodity suppliers. Both are legitimate businesses. There's nothing untoward or wrong with being this on this side. It's just a different business model. What's important is the line in the middle. We need to be able to distinguish one model from another. Advertisers cannot do that right now. If you're a trusted advisor, you act as agent in the definition of working in the interests of the client. You can be transparent. You must be transparent. You should be paid a fee. It doesn't have to be a fee for talent necessarily. That's a long discussion. But you need to pay for what you want from an agency. And your equation should be focused on value, much like Warren Buffett's good advice. Alternatively, you could see media as a commodity. It's perfectly legitimate to do that if you're focusing on more on really measurable outcomes. Then you can just look at an ROI of what you spend on media and what it does, and frankly, you may not care what media gets bought or what your agency makes, or in fact, even what they're recommending in the between those two poles. It's a different model. But it does give us, and it will allow customers, in this case advertisers, to be able to differentiate the market. Okay? So you guys, as independents, and those of you that are independent media agencies, this is an exciting time to be independent. It's never been more valuable. Independence has never been more valuable in media than it is right now. And I think the value of independent media agencies, you guys, will increase as that market increasingly differentiates. That's it. Thank you.
How many people in the audience would say that an important or critically important part of their job was building, maintaining, managing the relationship between the clients they represent and people, members of the public? Okay. There we have what I think is the fundamental dilemma facing the public relations business today. Because I suspect that if I was sitting in an audience, or if I was talking to an audience of public relations people, self-identified public relations people, and asked them the same question, their response would be almost the opposite, which is to say nearly everybody would put up their hands when I asked whether they were PR people. Very few of them, if they were being honest, and let's face it, they're PR people, so who knows. Very few of them, if they were being honest, could say with a straight face that what they did on a daily basis was managing relationships. Because actually, what most of them, certainly until the last 4 or 5 years, did on a daily basis was precisely the description that you just got. They sent out press releases, they held press conferences, they called up editors and reporters and tried to get them to write favorable stories or to quash unfavorable stories. That difference between what public relations as a discipline is, which is that management of a relationship, and what the public relations industry has done is, I think, at the core of the narrative that I want to share with you about the PR business today. And I'm hoping that the story here will be relevant to everybody, regardless of how you self-identify. Because I would make the case that in some very meaningful ways, we are all in this room in the business of public relations. And more to the point, the definitions and the barriers between the disciplines that you would describe yourself as working in are beginning to come down and collapse and evaporate in a way that makes an understanding of public relations fairly critical to everybody in this room. Now, I think that there have been two sort of seismic events in the last 5 or 10 years. The first is sort of the earthquake, and the second is sort of the aftershock. So the earthquake is the rise of digital and social media and the transformation that that has created in the PR and marketing disciplines. So when this first happened, we can pick an arbitrary date, but it's within the last decade. When this first happened, I was giving speeches in which I said, for marketers, social media changes everything. And what I meant by that was that the fundamental understanding of how a brand was created had changed for a lot of marketers. So 10 years ago, it was possible that if you were a CMO or a brand manager, you believed that the brand was all the things you told people it was. So the brand was defined by your advertising, your website, your sponsorship, your press releases, all of the things that you did and controlled. What happened as a result of social media was that it became apparent that actually the brand wasn't all the things that you told people it was. The brand was all the things that people said it was in the thousands, millions of conversations that were taking place out there in the world, which you could influence, but you could not control. And so I think what has happened in the last 10 years is that our understanding of what a brand really is has been forced to change fairly dramatically. This changed a lot for marketers. At the time, I was fond of saying this changes nothing for public relations people. For public relations people, the core principle has always been about third-party conversations. It's always been about what other people were saying about the brand. And the things that drove public relations, things like transparency, credibility, third-party endorsement, dialogue, conversation, engagement, were the things that were becoming more and more important in brand marketing. And they were things that public relations people, if they were doing their job properly, didn't need to change. Two things that need to be said about that. The first is that one thing very definitely changed, which is that the difference between doing your job well and doing your job badly became much more apparent once this new world took hold. It became apparent because if you did it badly, if you weren't transparent, if you weren't dialogue-based, if you didn't spend as much time listening as you did talking, if you weren't genuinely engaging with people, you got caught much more quickly and you got punished much more severely. And we have seen in the sort of crisis arena over the last few years that brands that don't operate on principles of integrity and transparency and honesty, that aren't credible, that aren't trustworthy, that don't listen, are the brands that will really suffer when crisis strikes. The second thing that needs to be said, my apologies to those who raised their hands to my first question, is that most public relations people weren't doing their jobs properly. And for those people, the world shifted pretty dramatically. The fact of the matter is that public relations had allowed itself to be defined by the tools it used, particularly earned media, rather than by the end result that I believe is the product of public relations. And the product of public relations is not, when it's done properly, a press release. It's not a news story. It's a relationship. And very, very few public relations people kept that approach of focusing on relationships in the years between the sort of founding of the profession where we were 5 or 6 years ago. And so as a result of that, I think that over the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a massive realignment in the public relations industry and a pretty dramatic transformation. Now, I mentioned the rise of digital and social media as the earthquake. The aftershock, I think, is the increasing convergence of different disciplines. And so what we are now seeing is a world in which public relations as a skill set is no longer as discrete and autonomous and separate from advertising, from digital, from social, as it once was. The barriers between the two things are permeable in a way that they never have been before. The most obvious manifestation of this is in Cannes. I don't unfortunately have a pun, but I do go to Cannes every year. And as somebody who is of the public relations industry, my reaction to the PR awards is always the same. I am tremendously encouraged by how much really great creative work is being done that wins public relations awards. I'm really excited that PR is getting recognized. I am a little depressed that fewer than a third of the lions that are handed out for public relations in Cannes go to what I would traditionally think of as public relations agencies. Those categories are being dominated by advertising agencies, by digital and social media firms. They are not being dominated by PR firms. And that suggests to me that people on the advertising side of the business have found it extremely easy to add public relations as a skill set. This is also happening inside corporations. And this is more of what worries me about the PR discipline right now, is that I believe in this new world that we're talking about, in order to be a successful CMO, you need to have a much broader understanding of the environment into which your products are being launched and the stakeholder groups that have impact on your products than ever before. So if you're an effective CMO today, there are several things you need to know that perhaps were not at the top of the agenda 5 or 10 years ago. For example, if you're an effective CMO today, I think you have to have a really strong grasp of employee communications. Because the reality is that in the world that I was talking about, where brands are built by conversations, a lot of those conversations are going to be influenced by your employees. Good or bad customer service is going to have a tremendous impact on what those conversations look like. Anytime one of your customers interacts with an employee, they are going to get an impression of your brand that is going to be part of it, the reality of your brand. And so in order to be an effective CMO today, you need to understand employee communications. In order to be an effective CMO today, you need to understand the halo effect that comes from things like corporate social responsibility or course-related marketing. In order to be an effective CMO today, you need to understand that you have a crisis plan before you bring a new product to market. In order to be an effective CMO today, you need to have an understanding of the regulatory and legislative and issues environment in which your product is going to be featured, because all of those things have the potential to intervene between you and the consumer and make your job more difficult than it ever has been before. In other words, in order to be an effective CMO today, you need to be a public relations person. You need an understanding of all the things that traditionally were part of the corporate communications function rather than the marketing function. And this is rendering CCOs, Chief Communications Officer, a slightly grandiose title that frankly only began to enter the conversation about 5 years ago, increasingly irrelevant. Suddenly, if your marketing colleague has a thorough understanding of employee comms and CSR and corporate reputation and public affairs and issues management, there's not actually much left for the CCO to do. And we recently produced a piece of research working with USC and a few trade associations called the Global Communications Report, in which we went out and talked to CCOs about how their jobs were changing. And the findings, particularly for agency people, well, for both clients and agencies, I suspect, were mildly alarming in two ways. First of all, CCOs, looking 5 years ahead, essentially saw their budgets increasing at about the rate of inflation. There was very little optimism that their budgets would grow. Secondly, when we asked about the mix of channels that CCOs were going to be using in the future, there was virtually no recognition that that mix of channels was going to change. So if you broke it down by paid, earned, shared, and owned, most CCOs felt that the future would look sort of like today, only more so. Earned might dwindle a little. Shared, social media platforms, I guess, in particular, would increase. But there was no sense that they were going to have to spend a lot more money on paid media. There was no sense that the CCO was going to have more control over owned media. Those things were viewed as belonging elsewhere in the organization. And this creates a fundamental dilemma for the PR agency, because the PR agency sells to two different constituencies. It sells to the corporate communications department, and it sells to the marketing department. And the dilemma is this. One of the people that the PR industry sells to has a great understanding and sympathy for what it does, and no money. The other has a ton of money. Marketing budgets are growing at a pretty healthy rate and being redistributed in all kinds of interesting ways, and almost zero appreciation of what PR agencies can do. Most PR agencies are not viewed by marketers as a strategic resource. Going back to what I said earlier, they have allowed themselves over the years to be viewed as essentially a press release factory, a publicity factory, an earned media factory. And as we move into this converged era, it is increasingly apparent that the things that PR can do well are not valued, and the things that are valued, PR cannot or is not currently doing well. And there are, I think, 4 or 5 imperatives for PR moving forward that I suspect will resonate with those of you who are in other sectors of the marketing services, communications business, because they're the same challenges everybody faces. Everybody, it seems to be, is jockeying to be the MVP within the marketing team. Everybody wants to be capable of creating the brand platform that all disciplines follow. Everybody wants to be the strategic lead for the client. That is where the great value, the money, the satisfaction in our industry is going to come from. And the other piece of research that we do every year studies the growth of the public relations industry at a time when I think all of the things that I said earlier are becoming more important. the traditional values of public relations, transparency, credibility, are all becoming more important. We are not seeing growth in the public relations industry the way we should. The fact of the matter is that this year, growth in our industry was about 6%. Growth among the holding company PR agencies, particularly those owned by the giants, so WPP, Omnicom, Republic, which own Publicis, which between them own 9 of the top 10, is at best anemic, certainly under 4%. It is incomprehensible to me that at a time when engagement is so much more important than bombardment, PR agencies that are held by publicly traded companies are growing slower than their advertising brethren. I literally don't understand how that could be happening outside of extraordinarily bad management. But there are several imperatives that I think these agencies are missing out on. And almost all of them have to do with talent. Almost all of them have to do with the kind of people who are working in this business. I would go so far as to say that the business has changed so much that about half the people working in the PR business 2 years ago are not fit for purpose today, and certainly won't be fit for purpose 2 years ahead today. That's how badly the industry needs to change. We have an industry which, until relatively recently, was populated almost entirely by the same kinds of people with the same kind of skill set. So regardless of whether you were a junior account executive or a senior vice president, what you were good at was pitching stories to the media. You were good at either writing a press release or maybe calling up the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, sitting down with them and explaining your story. But you were essentially good at connecting with the media. That is clearly no longer enough. And so the PR industry, like I suspect almost every other industry that's represented in this room, needs vastly different kinds of people today. The first kind of people we need are people who understand data and analytics. And the PR industry is a long way behind the ad business and probably most other disciplines in this regard. But there is a very simple equation at play here. The person with the best data will have the best insight. The person with the best insight will come up with the best strategy. The person with the best strategy will set the direction for the client and be the most valuable person in the room when decisions are being made. If we do not, as an industry, have data, if we don't know how to mine data and how to extract from that data the raw material that creates insight, we are going to be a long way behind from the very outset. And that's a problem that we're facing right now. And I was at a conference 5 years ago in which somebody said, any PR agency that doesn't have a chief data officer is already out of the game. The reality is that of the top 100 PR firms, 11 currently have somebody with that title or that responsibility. We're not moving fast enough on that front. The second thing, which relates back to the opening presentation of this session, is that we need people who understand social science, behavioral economics, neuroscience, all of the things that go into real-world decision-making. I spent, as the introduction alluded to, about 20 years living in the States, and so my political framework is American. And I'm fond of saying that PR people are like Democrats and advertising people are like Republicans. And I certainly don't mean that as an insult to any advertising people in the room. But what I mean by that is that PR people have historically had this strangely touching faith in facts, in the idea that if you just present people with the information that they need to make the right decision, they will go out and make it. And this came home to me during the debate over Obamacare. Because what you had during this debate was almost a classic Republican-Democrat mix. On the one side, you had the Democrats saying, you'll have 20 million new people covered by healthcare insurance who didn't have it before. You'll bring down the cost of healthcare. You know, there were data points like you wouldn't believe, showing all the benefits of healthcare. And what Republicans did, rather than challenging those data points, was tell stories. They would find somebody who had suffered, or in some cases even believed that they had suffered as a result of Obamacare, put them in front of a camera and have them tell their story. And the fact of the matter is that stories move people in a way that data and facts and figures do not. And we as public relations people have never quite understood that. And there are fascinating examples of this. I mean, I am, by your standards at least, a novice in the field of neuroscience, but there are things that fascinate me. So, for example, there are studies that show that if you take people who do not believe in climate change and provide them with all of the authoritative science that proves that climate change is taking place, their original views become even stronger. In other words, they don't look at the facts and go, boy, you're right, we should change our minds. They look at the facts and go, boy, the conspiracy to sell me climate change is even wider reaching than I thought it was. These people are even more pernicious than I thought they were. I must resist the climate change movement at all costs. And you end up using what seems like a perfectly rational public relations tactic, moving the needle in entirely the opposite direction. We have to understand how decisions really get made. We have to understand that moving images, and by that I mean both video and moving in the emotional sense, are much more powerful than the kind of fact-based approach that we've used far too often in the past. We need to bring in people who are great at content creation. We need to bring in people who know how to create videos. We need to bring in people who understand how to create infographics. We need to bring in animators. We need to bring in people who know different forms of storytelling. This is sort of a left field suggestion that I've been giving some of my friends in the PR industry. Hire a stand-up comedian, because stand-up comedians understand a form of storytelling that really works. I have friends who do this for a living, not much of a living, but a living. And the way that they tell stories, the way that they craft stories, the way that they pick individual words, depending on the audience response, is incredibly detail-oriented, incredibly thoughtful, and not at all what we see in the traditional PR industry. And then we need people who can focus on metrics. And I believe that there has to be a fundamental sea change in the way we measure the effectiveness of campaigns that has implications not only for public relations, but for everybody in this room. Because I think that we have moved into an age where, because we're focusing more and more on engagement, because we're focusing more and more on this constituency that can build your brand on your behalf, because we're focusing on conversations that take place in the real world rather than all the messages that we send out into that world, we need to have a metric that focuses on that. And I believe that there is a way to adopt something similar to, how many people in the room are familiar with Net Promoter Score? Okay, that's encouraging. So I believe that there is a Net Promoter Score essentially asks a simple question: would you recommend this company, this product, to a friend? You can ask this question of employees, you can ask it of consumers, you can ask it of the media, you can ask it of any stakeholder group that you may want to deal with. Would you recommend this company as a neighbor? Would you recommend them as an employer? Net Promoter Score basically takes the people who say, hell yes, I love this company, subtracts from those people that say, hell no, I hate this company, and comes up with a number that is hopefully as high as possible. I believe that everything we do as communicators in this world ought to be about maximizing the number of people who are fans and advocates of your company, maximizing the number of people who are out there telling their friends how great you are, and minimizing the number of people who are out there telling their friends how much you suck. And I think that that is the fundamental metric of public relations. How many great relationships did I create, and how many bad relationships did I manage to neutralize or turn positive? But I also think that is the ultimate objective for all of us in this room right now. I think that there are arguments to be made that this is a more effective metric than simple sales. Sales can be transactional. You can buy sales by doing all kinds of negative things. Relationships are enduring and permanent and long-lasting, and if you manage them correctly, can be leveraged for a long, long time. And we all ought to be aiming for that. The challenge, I think, is for public relations people to start to understand all of this stuff anew, to go back to what are essentially the roots of the public relations profession in the days of Ed Bernays and Arthur W. Page and the pioneers of this discipline. And at the same time, for everybody to let this kind of understanding of a relationship-driven approach to marketing permeate their thinking too. At the end of the day, I write about public relations. Nothing would please me more than the next time I come here, I assume we're going to do this again, the next time I come here, when I ask who self-identifies as a public relations person, everybody in the room could put up their hands, not because you've all moved over to working for PR agencies, but because the businesses that you are in have become relationship-focused and relationship-driven, regardless of whether the tool you use to build a relationship is an ad, a website, a social media forum, a press release, or anything else that helps to form a bond between a marketer and a consumer. Because that's where we're all headed. Whoever gets there first, whoever learns everybody else's stuff first, is going to win. Thank you very much.